Yeah, it's 1:35 in the morning on December 9th.
Michael took a closer look and realized there were several people walking on the dock with flashlights. A few minutes later, someone frantically knocked on the hull of the boat to let us know what was happening.
And we've got Winter Storm. It has a name, and I've already forgotten it, but it really just blew through and is hitting us really hard here on the lake. So hard, in fact, that our dock, the entire dock, has come off of its anchor and we've drifted into the next dock. So we're on J dock and we're drifted into K dock. Thankfully the dock isn't moving anymore and we're okay for now, but we're gonna stay up and keep a watch. If we have to, we'll untie and tie up to another dock.
I think that has been one of the biggest surprises, has been that living on the lake, it can have potentially dangerous weather, and this is one of those examples. We've been keeping really close attention to the weather, and we knew about it. We've been sitting here all day, and it's been mainly windy, and then it got gusty at night, and we thought, that'll be the worst of it, but clearly that's not the case.
Thankfully on our side, we have access to get out. The people on boats on the other side, where we've got a couple of friends on that side of the dock, they are stuck because they are right up against the other boats over there. And so we're all keeping in contact and making sure that everybody's okay. And if we have to get out of here, then people can hop on board. And yeah, Bowie's not afraid at all. We are removing our mast and rigging tomorrow, so really the only thing that we can do today is we have some plywood that we are going to cut down to plug up our mast step, the partners up here. And then after that, we will leave some of the wiring in place that runs up the mast, but we are going to remove the wind instruments so that that'll be ready to go, because obviously the wiring up the mast needs to be disconnected at the base so that the mast can come out. So that's what we'll be doing today. Now I'm just going to make a quick and dirty measurement of the width. We'll be clamping the two pieces of wood together, and we'll use some Life Seal caulk in some areas to help keep water out if there is any. It's simple, not too much to worry about here. And yeah, that gives us a basic measurement, and this is probably overkill for the width, but it'll plug this up nicely.
What do you think, Ilana? Did he do a good job?
So we have this piece of wood we cut down yesterday, and it fits kind of perfectly in alignment with the partners here. And you know, I could tell that this is about center, so I'll probably end up just putting two spots right here. Doesn't have to be perfect, but we'll make this work. The second one. Okay, now we just have a bolt with a easy toggle on the other end. Cool. Now let's go see if we have enough clearance on the other side just to dog this straight down, or if we need to make a plate that will receive it properly on the other side. All we'll need to do is remove that board, and we'll line up a couple of spots close to center on this so that we have as much clearance on the rooftop here to hold this in place. And basically we're just going to wedge the two together and that'll hold. Doesn't seem like a lot, but trust me, it is. Now we're just going to line this up, just kind of push it through the plastic bag. Do the same thing with this one, but we'll be sure not to push these down all the way quite yet, because we are going to use this life caulk that I mentioned. One of the great things about this life caulk is that it's a polysulfide base, which makes it really good for weather sealing little applications like this. It's non-adhesive, so it's not like 3M's 5200, which is kind of like the bane of most people's existence if they ever have to remove it. So it comes off really easily, but it gives a really good weather seal. The other really great thing about this stuff and why it's good to have it on board if it's not dried out is that if you're in a situation where you realize that you have a leaky hatch, you can use this and it will dry while wet. It dries underwater. So that's pretty cool stuff. It could also be sanded and painted if you have an application where it needs sand and paint after it's finished. So really good stuff. Now I'm lining up the bolts with our other piece that we're going to be bolting into place. Esther's going to run above and actually hold everything down so that we can dog all this down into a nice sandwich. We just finished things off down here we have a couple of washers and then just these toggle bolt nuts which have been tightened down. It's quite secure. We've pulled on it from the deck side. It's not going to go anywhere, and we should have a good enough weather seal. Like I said, it's not a permanent solution because it is not a permanent problem. She just needs to be very temporary, maybe 3 weeks, since we will keep the mast off while we get new rigging. If I was laying the boat up over the winter, if we were up north, I might come up with something a little bit more robust, but given our needs, this is perfect. So now we are going to disconnect our wind instruments where they connect to the hub, or actually it's just a splicing point at the base of the mast. Ours is actually in this part of the bilge, and it's kind of a tight little spot. Please ignore our filthy bilge at the bottom. That's on our project list to do. But it is mounted. There's a little hub that's mounted on this side, and there are several wires, your red, yellow, green, blue, and ground, that all mount to the splice plate that's in here. And so we will be removing those wires so that the line can be fed back up through. There's a little hole on the front bulkhead here that runs into the base side of the mast so that when we are hauling, we don't pull that wire and damage it or destroy it. I do have a sneaking suspicion that we're replacing that wire anyway, but we don't want to do any potential damage. Just because I think there's a break in the line because we haven't been able to get our wind instruments to work in the last year, even though I've rewired this several times. Okay, so you can see the cover of the splicing box right there with the lovely Auto Helm logo. We will be popping that off, and once I get it off, I'll show you what the wires look like in there, but this is a really tight area, so we won't be filming the process of me doing this. Esther asked me a really good question off camera about whether or not this is common for all boats, and the one thing I will say is that I'm not sure how deck fitting works for a deck stepped mast. I know that you're going to have some breaking point on all your wires, especially these types of wires that run up the mast, whether it's electrical or whether it is for your instruments. They are not easily spliced. So essentially you would never cut these wires, repair them, unless you had a breaking point like what we have here. We want to keep our radio working for now, especially since we have an hour to motor, just in case. We want to have access to our radio. Even though on the lake we have cell service, but still, it's just another safety thing, so we're not disconnecting that right now. Since we have a keel step mast, all of these connections and splicing points are in our bilge. How that works if you have a deck step mast is a question that I don't know the answer to, but other than the fact that there will be some breaking point, some connection point, either at deck level or maybe the wires come in through your deck and you have a plate underneath, like somewhere on your cabin rooftop. But they will be there, and so if you need to get your mast down, you're going to have a similar process. It may not be exactly the same, but you will have things to disconnect. So
we're on our way to step our mast. How's it feel, Michael?
It's exciting.
Yeah?
Yeah. It's like the next step. It's happening. It's been kind of like abstract. Even though we've done a lot of work, it's still kind of felt a little abstract until now.
Yeah.
And, As mentioned yesterday, there was additional wiring that needed to be undone at the junction at the base of the mast. What I've gotten out here is the coax for the VHF, and this is just hand tight, and I had pre-loosened it. And what I want to do at this point, now that I've disconnected that, is I want to keep this end free, because this is the side that the wire goes up the mast through there's a passage right down in here. We don't want the wires tangled as the mast is coming out. And that's just to keep things neat. Nothing really terrible will go wrong. You just have to undo them. And then here's the 12-volt wiring. Goes up to our anchor light and our steaming light, as well as our deck light. So that was wrapped with some electrical tape that I've already removed, and that literally just comes undone. We have a little bit of corrosion here that we're going to clean up before we put that back, I could tell you already. But other than that, we're pretty much good. So again, we just want to kind of free these wires. Everything on this side goes up the mast, and then everything on this side stays with the boat. So I'm just going to tuck those back, and that'll make everything easier. The nice thing about the Island Packet is the keel step, the mast just sits on the keel step. Depending upon your boat, you might have some bolts at the bottom, at the base here. So you might want to be aware of that and be sure that you don't have anything holding the mast back when it is being lifted. We have a pin in our mast at the deck level, which not all boats have, and that tricked us when the first time we stepped the mast. So I'll show you that when we get to it. All right, so now we're going to clear the mast boot. Please don't look at this as an example of the right way to do this. I've been reading Don Casey's sailboat maintenance manual, and I realized that we could do this so much better. This was the first time I'd ever put in a mast boot, and I really kind of gacked it. So, not good. So basically all we're going to do is we're going to remove these straps and clear those out of the way, and then I'll cut this old boot free. And then we'll get that pin that I talked about out. So, the one thing I do need to do is clear out some of this caulk over here. And the reason I need to do that is that pin that I mentioned is right here. And it passes through to this side. And if I remember correctly, we installed the pin this way, so that means it's going to come out this way.
Okay, so next steps are to loosen our turnbuckles and to remove the cotter pins on our shrouds, and including our backstays. So we tried this a moment ago where I tried to pull out the cotter pin first, and it was a little tricky. So this is how you don't get it out. So we just have a wrench and a screwdriver, and you just grab here, and then you take your screwdriver and you turn clockwise, and we just want to loosen, not completely. You can see like how loose that is. So let's see if we can grab the cotter pin.
Those pins might have been too big.
Yeah, the size.
Huh. They should slip out a lot easier than that. Well,
this is where my stunt double comes in. You won't notice any difference in our hands.
Yeah, these pins that we used last time are too large. They should slide right out. We ended up getting all the cotter pins out. It appears as though they're all not only slightly oversized, but I made a mistake of going to a big box store and getting them, and I don't think that they were actually stainless steel, even though they were labeled stainless steel. Or they were very poor grade stainless steel, because they were breaking and kind of corroded and falling apart, which should not have happened if they were quality. But anyway, they're all out now, and we will get quality ones next time. But what we've done is we've loosened all of the stays so that they are now just a couple of hand turns away from being completely free. We don't want to take all of the tension out of the system until the crane is on the mast, but we have enough so that we're not wasting anybody's time. We did remove the lower shrouds because those are not really doing anything at the moment. There's no sail up, there's no bend in the middle of the mast that is dangerous at this point. So we felt comfortable removing those, so that's a little bit less to do once we get the crane hooked up. So we just have our cap shrouds, our backstays, and then the forestay. All of the pins are out, tension is let out of the system, so it should come down fairly easily once the crane is ready. Since there's only two of us, Esther will go through and take the tension out of the backstays while I remove the pin from the forestay right here. And then once that's all done, Esther will hold on to the forestay while I get the cap shrouds and then go down below to hold the mast to make sure it doesn't bounce off of the inside of our teak work, which would be a tragedy. So we definitely don't want that to happen. So yeah, that's kind of the plan. Then once the mast is free of the cabin, I'll come above and we already have a line ready that I'll tie off the shrouds while Esther walks these back to the mast, and we'll tie them all off together, just enough to keep them from flopping around while they bring the crane and drop our mast on some sawhorses up above. Then we'll clear all the shrouds either today or tomorrow. We'll take them all off, coil them, then we just have to wrap the mast. What we're going to start with is removing our instruments, our anemometer and wind direction, and we'll remove our VHF antenna as well as our manual windlass. So we'll get that all cleared up. And then from there, we'll start removing our backstays, the cap shrouds, and the lowers. So we're going to clean all that up, and then we'll move on to the furling gear. We decided really quickly to remove our forward stay and our staysail stay just because they're laying on the spreader the way this is up on the sawhorses. So yeah, we're just gonna pop that out first. So far, the only tools that we've used and probably will use today are a pair of pliers and a couple of screwdrivers. So just to kind of show you that this is not taking things down in this way, since we're not actually re-rigging and doing anything with swage fittings or with staylock fittings, we really don't need any specialized tools. The way our cap shrouds are rigged is we actually have this block terminal. It's like a ball fitting that is swaged, and then that swage then passes through the top of the mast and is held into place. We will be replacing all of these, and I believe that Seiko South, who's doing our rigging, said that this will now be a staylock style fitting that's still capped with a ball end and not swaged, which will be cool. And the rest of our fittings will go to staylock instead of swaged as well. So exciting stuff. Just want to quickly point out, this is our port cap shroud. So we are going to put a little piece of tape here with like port CS so that we know that it's the port side cap shroud, because we will be reusing these turnbuckles. They are made out of brass and they're in good shape other than some light oxidation. So yeah, we're going to label all that so that we know where everything goes later. We are, however, going to replace the actual standing rigging, and I just want to kind of point out why and what we're seeing. Overall, they're in decent shape. There's no major pitting or there's no broken strands, but there is a decent amount of oxidation up in this plate right here. And when we inspected the boat, we weren't sure what the lifespan was on this rig, like if it was original or if it had been replaced. When we came to the lake, you know, we could pick our days to sail so that we weren't in heavy air. So we decided that it would be okay and that we'd re-rig the next time when we go back out to the coast. So this is all going to be gone. but we can still reuse these, and that saves us several $100s. We are going to prepare removing the cap shroud and also taking off the spreaders, because the spreaders have to come off. And the way the island packet mast is set up, the boot ends are built into the rigging. So we just have a screw here that needs to come out, and there's one on the other side, which came out on its own. It stripped out, so we're gonna have to remember to drill out an oversized screw so that we can have a safe setup here. But then we have 2-part here that passes through. Now the shroud can be dropped, and we'll put this back together so we don't lose anything. And now on the mast side of the spreader, we have a cotter ring, which I already have pre-pulled, and another clevis pin that is going to need just a little bit of coercion. And once that pops off, then the spreader can be removed. Again, for safekeeping, we'll get that pin back in, and we're also going to note we have a little bit of oxidation there as well, so we'll make sure we clean that up before we put everything back together. Other than that, this ring just needs to go back on, and we can call it good.
Next up, what we did was get all of our shrouds together and zip tied them all nice and neat so they'll be easy to stow away for the shipping. We also moved all of our halyards up to the top and gathered up all the lines here nice and neat, and we will then take carpet that we bought pretty reasonably on sale at Home Depot. So we'll take strips of that and make sure to cover key areas of the mast to keep it protected. We will duct tape that carpet over those parts, and then we will use the shrink wrap to go on top like a nice mast burrito.
Alright, so all I did there was I sprayed some PB Blaster penetrating oil into the set screws on the foils just to break away any corrosion or anything that might be kind of holding those in place. And while that sets up and while that gets in there to do its job, we're going to take apart the jib furler. We're going to make a few marks on the inside of the furler where the stay connects to the furler. Since we are replacing this rig, of course there's some tolerances in there, adjustments we can make. We'll want to know where the stay meets the fitting so that we can get a good measurement. The first thing we're going to remove is these 4 bolts that hold on the foil. It's like the foil clamp. And then there's 3 screws that go in and hold at the base here. Once that's removed, we should be able to slide the foil up, and that'll expose where the stay fitting meets the furler, which is where we'll make those marks I was talking about so we can get good measurements later. The way that this is pulling up, it's not leaving much room for the socket to get in and do its job. So how I believe we need to do this is back all these out fairly evenly. That'll give us enough room to get those out. And now that it's loose enough and there's not enough pressure to hold this in place, I can move it where I need it, so I can get each of these out individually. It was just getting it started. So these are going to need a little help. All right, while that sets up, we have the feeder for the sail. The wire from the front end of the sail runs up and is fed through this track up the furler. So this will need to come off anyway so that we can move this foil up and expose the area that we need. So while the PB Blaster does its job, we will get that piece off. I just worked some PB Blaster into this, the magical penetrating oil. And yeah, as you can see, it broke free. And unlike yesterday, I'm being super cautious here because I was an idiot yesterday and this fell out of my hand and got away from us, so it's somewhere in this kind of junk for our staysail furler, which is, you know, a real bummer, of course. Yeah, I had to run back to the boat and get some more tools. I had one really stubborn bolt on the furler. Everything else came undone, but this one bolt. I noticed there wasn't any Loctite placed on these bolts, which means that the connection is a little corroded together. So I went ahead and grabbed a heat gun and our power drill in hopes that a little bit more leverage and a little bit of heat will help get that unstuck. Other than that, everything else is coming along. As you could see, that one foil was a little bit hard to get off, and it still is. I think I'm just going to leave that on, and then when we cut the stays later to get the internal part of the foil, that the set screws that hold the foil into place, when we cut the stay, those will all come off and we'll be able to get that final foil off. I think just leave it for now instead of fighting it. I think it is tapered at the end so that it doesn't come off, meaning that it catches on that internal piece for the foil structure. That's my assumption, because there was just not any reasonable way to get it through, and if anybody knows, please let us know. Now I'm heading back. Got extra tools that I probably should have just brought to begin with, but I thought that hand tools would get it, because yesterday hand tools were plenty to finish the job. So off we go. Now we just need to back this off, and that will expose the stay fitting. For that, we'll just take this wrench, counterbalance against the furler, and it should give itself, yep, there we go. Once it gets started, I might be able to get it by hand. We'll see. Sadly, the way this is supposed to be fit is that this lock should back off and clear and slide further up, and basically the stay itself should not be spinning along with the fitting, but in this case it is. So we've actually backed the thread out on the line, so we don't know exactly where this was originally set for tension on the stay. We still will be able to make good measurements. I'm going to clean this up after it comes off, and I'll throw a line with just a Sharpie, just so we know kind of where the edge of this fitting was before we back that off, because we will need to get this off, obviously, to get the rest of the furler taken apart. For now, we'll just clear this. It's not a perfect solution, but it'll just kind of help us when we need to make measurements when we refit our new stay. So I was able to free this fitting. You could see where previously somebody put channel locks on the end of this swage fitting. So essentially I just took these pliers, held this in place while this spun fairly freely, and it was enough that I could, with some effort, pull it off. I also made a mark where this fitting was in place, because then that can help us make those measurements later too. And to point out, in case you're thinking this, why not just measure the end of the stay to the other end where the toggle is? And we will do that, and we'll likely try to, within some degree of accuracy, match the overall length. But depending upon if the new stay lock fittings are a different size, we want to kind of know at least where things were kind of mapped out, so that we don't under or over cut our new stay. Obviously, going too long, we won't be able to get proper tension in the furling system, and going too short has its own obvious problems. So I'm going to do a quick job of cleaning this up and actually throw a piece of tape where these marks are with a couple of wraps, just so we can, because that Sharpie will clearly come off. It is permanent marker, but it's not that permanent. And then after that, we're just going to disassemble the foils and coil up this line, and we are done with packing up the mast. We pull the boat out of the water in less than 24 hours. So we are organizing the cabin and the aft berth with things that are to be stowed away so that they don't fly everywhere while traveling.
Yeah. Basically looks like the boat threw up a little. And now there's more. Take a look at the aft berth here. The aft berth actually looks the neatest right now. We wanted to point out and suggest to consider definitely time of year that you're shipping a boat above ground. So meaning, like for us right now, we're shipping during the winter, and as it turned out, we had an unexpected winter storm a couple nights ago and had a bit of a mishap on our dock. And there are obviously factors out of our control that might delay or impact your moving process. So one of the big things we would suggest is to build in a little bit of buffer time before and after. With our moving, the boat shipper, he had a delay on his end that was hard to control, and that pushed us back a few days. For instance, this past week it's been super rainy and cold, but as you can see, today is sunny. We were just saying, like, oh, if it was rainy, that may have either made it a very miserable long cold day, or we would have had to push things back. Michael had the great idea earlier, like a week or so ago, to go ahead and step our mast and schedule that with the crane and everything and move that up a few days in advance of when we actually ship the boat, which it's even more brilliant now considering the wonky weather we've had. So just to keep that in mind, build in some buffer time, have a backup plan.
Another thing to point out is that when we get to Florida, Florida has thunderstorms year-round, and a crane cannot operate if there are active thunderstorms in the area. So you really want to give yourself as much room as possible.
And if you hear panting in the background,